The $20 bill felt paper-thin between my trembling fingers as the red taillights of Jessica's SUV disappeared into the evening traffic. The Greyhound station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across cracked concrete where I stood with nothing but my old purse and the clothes on my back. My own daughter had just looked me in the eye and said, "You want to be independent so badly, Mom? Prove it. Survive on your own." Then she drove away, leaving me there like I was nothing more than an unwanted piece of furniture she'd finally decided to throw out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though most folks call me Maggie, and at 67 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself abandoned at a bus station by the very child I'd given my entire life to raise. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same station where I'd dropped Jessica off for her first college trip 24 years ago. Tears streaming down my face as I watched her board that bus to Ohio State, so proud of the young woman she'd become. Now here I was, gray-haired and shaking, wondering how that bright-eyed girl had transformed into someone capable of such cruelty. The whole nightmare had started 3 weeks earlier when I'd taken what Jessica dramatically called a tumble down the front steps of my little ranch house on Elm Street. It wasn't even a real fall, just a slip on some wet leaves that left me with a bruised hip and scraped palms. Nothing that a hot bath and some aspirin couldn't handle, but you'd have thought I'd broken every bone in my body the way Jessica carried on about it. She'd been on me for months about moving into Sunny Meadows Assisted Living, that sterile place out on Route 9 where they serve lukewarm meals and treat residents like children who've forgotten how to think for themselves. "Mom, you're not getting any younger," she'd said that awful morning, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed and that determined look she'd inherited from her father. "What if you'd hit your head? What if nobody had found you for hours? I can't keep worrying about you living alone in this house." I'd tried to explain that I wasn't alone, not really. Mrs. Patterson next door checked on me daily, and I had my routines, my independence, my little garden where I grew tomatoes that actually tasted like something. I'd lived in that house for 32 years, raised Jessica there after her father Frank died when she was just 14. Every room held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of helping her with homework at the kitchen table and teaching her to drive in, the driveway that Frank had paved himself the summer before his heart attack. But Jessica had made up her mind, and when my daughter set her sights on something, she was like a dog with a bone. She'd already been to tour Sunny Meadows, had brochures spread across my dining room table like evidence in a court case. The place cost $3,000 a month, money I didn't have and money she couldn't afford either, though she kept insisting we'd figure it out somehow. What she really meant was that I'd have to sell the house, the only thing of value I had left in this world, to pay for the privilege of being warehoused with a bunch of strangers who'd shuffle around in their pajamas all day watching game shows. "I won't do it," I'd told her firmly, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I won't sell Frank's house to pay for some place where I'll just sit around waiting to die." That's when Jessica's mask slipped, revealing the calculating woman she'd become. "Mom, you're being selfish. Do you know what this is doing to my family?" Sophie and Tyler need their mother focused on them, not constantly worried about whether their grandmother is going to break her neck walking to the mailbox. Carlos is working 16-hour days trying to keep his construction business afloat, and I'm showing houses 6 days a week just to make ends meet. We don't have time to babysit you anymore. Babysit me. The words stung worse than any physical pain from my fall. This from the daughter I'd supported through college, working double shifts in the school cafeteria to pay her tuition, the daughter whose children I'd watched every summer vacation, every snow day, every time she and Carlos wanted a weekend getaway. The daughter whose mortgage I'd helped with when Carlos's business hit rough patches, dipping into my modest savings, account without a second thought because that's what mothers do. "I've never asked you to babysit me," I'd said quietly. but Jessica was already rolling her eyes. Really, Mom? Who drove you to your doctor's appointments last month? Who does your grocery shopping when it rains because you're afraid to drive? Who comes over every Sunday to make sure you're eating properly and taking your medications? You lean on us for everything, but the minute we suggest something that would actually help, you dig in your heels like a stubborn child. I wanted to point out that I'd been taking care of myself just fine for 8 years since Frank passed, that the doctor's appointments were routine checkups, and the grocery trips were more about having company than needing help. I wanted to remind her of all the times I'd dropped everything to watch Sophie and Tyler when they were sick, or when she had showings that ran late, or when Carlos was out of town on construction jobs. But the look in Jessica's eyes told me it wouldn't matter. She'd already written the story in her head, and in that version, I was nothing but a burden. The argument escalated over the following days. Jessica would arrive unannounced with Carlos in tow, the two of them presenting a united front as they tried to wear down my resistance. They brought real estate listings, talked about market values and equity, made it sound like selling my home was not just sensible, but inevitable. Carlos, bless his heart, seemed uncomfortable with the whole thing, but he stood by his wife even when I caught him looking around my living room with something that might have been regret. "Mrs. Thompson," he'd said one afternoon while Jessica was in the bathroom, "maybe we could look at some other options. There are nice senior communities that aren't as expensive as Sunny Meadows." But Jessica overheard and shut that down immediately. "Carlos, we've been through this. Mom needs medical supervision available 24/7. She's not going to get that in some independent living place where she can still pretend nothing has changed." That's when I realized what this was really about. It wasn't concern for my safety or well-being. It was Jessica's need to control everything around her, to have neat solutions to messy problems. Having an elderly mother living independently didn't fit into her perfectly organized world, so I had to be managed, contained, institutionalized for her peace of mind. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in early October. I'd made pot roast, Frank's favorite recipe, hoping that a nice family dinner might remind Jessica of better times when we actually enjoyed each other's company. Sophie and Tyler seemed happy enough, chattering about school and their friends while they helped set the table. For a moment, it felt like old times, like we were still a family instead of adversaries in some bitter negotiation. But halfway through dinner, Jessica brought up Sunny Meadows again. She'd apparently scheduled another tour for the following week and expected me to attend with her. When I politely declined, she set down her fork with a sharp clink that made Tyler jump. "Mom, I'm tired of playing games with you. You fell down 3 weeks ago and you could fall again tomorrow. What happens when you break a hip, or worse? Are you going to call me from the emergency room and expect me to drop everything to come running?" "I've never expected you to drop everything," I said, trying to keep my voice level in front of the children. "I've been taking care of myself since before you were born, and I'm perfectly capable of continuing to do so." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Capable? Mom, you can barely manage this house. The gutters are full of leaves. The furnace makes that weird noise. And don't even get me started on the state of your finances. When's the last time you balanced your checkbook?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "My finances are none of your business, Jessica Marie." "They are when you're going to run out of money and expect us to support you," she snapped back. "Do you think we're made of money? Do you think Carlos and I don't have our own problems to worry about?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Tyler was staring down at his plate like he wished he could disappear. I hated that they were witnessing this, that Jessica was willing to have this fight in front of her own children. "Maybe we should discuss this later," I suggested, nodding toward the kids. "No, Mom. We're discussing it now. I'm done tiptoeing around your feelings. You're moving to Sunny Meadows, and that's final. I've already put a deposit down." The words hit me, like a physical blow. She'd put down a deposit without even telling me, had made decisions about my life as if I were already incompetent to make them myself. The pot roast turned to sawdust in my mouth, and I could feel tears threatening behind my eyes. You had no right, I whispered. I had every right, Jessica shot back. Somebody has to be the adult here, and it's clearly not going to be you. That's when something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way she dismissed me so casually, or the fact that she'd made irreversible decisions behind my back, or simply the accumulation of weeks of being treated like an inconvenient problem rather than a person with feelings and dignity. Get out, I said quietly. Jessica blinked. What? I said get out of my house, all of you, right now. Mom, don't be ridiculous. We're in the middle of dinner. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking with anger. This is still my house, Jessica, whether you like it or not. And I'm telling you to leave. Carlos was already reaching for his jacket, clearly eager to escape the tension, but Jessica remained seated with her arms crossed. Fine, throw your little tantrum, but this conversation isn't over, and I'm not backing down. You can pout all you want, but you're still moving to Sunny Meadows. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen surrounded by the remains of our ruined dinner, wondering how things had gotten so bad between us. When had my daughter stopped seeing me as her mother and started viewing me as nothing more than an obligation? When had love been replaced by resentment and family bonds twisted into weapons used to hurt each other? The next morning, Jessica called bright and early with an ultimatum that would change both our lives forever. Her voice was cold and businesslike, like she was negotiating a real estate deal rather than talking to her mother. I've been thinking about last night, she said without preamble. And I've decided you're right about one thing. You want to be independent so badly? You want to make your own decisions without any input from your family? Fine. Prove it. Something in her tone made my stomach clench. What do you mean? I mean it's time for some tough love, Mom. You clearly think you don't need us, so let's see how well you do without us. Pack a bag. I'm picking you up in an hour. Jessica, what are you talking about? Pick me up for what? You'll see. And Mom, bring whatever cash you have in the house. You're going to need it. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in confusion and growing dread. I tried calling back, but Jessica didn't answer. An hour later, she pulled into my driveway with the engine running and her face set in grim determination. Get in, she said when I approached the car. Where are we going? What's this about? You want independence? I'm going to give you more. Independence than you know what to do with. Now get in the car or I'll leave without you. Against my better judgment, I climbed into the passenger seat. Jessica drove in silence through the familiar streets of Riverside, past the elementary school where I'd worked for 23 years, past the church where Frank and I were married, past all the landmarks of my ordinary life. It wasn't until she pulled into the Greyhound station that I began to understand what she intended. Jessica, what are we doing here? She turned off the engine and looked at me with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. You want to prove you can take care of yourself? Here's your chance. There's a bus leaving for anywhere you want to go in about 20 minutes. Pick a destination, buy a ticket, and show me just how independent you really are. I stared at her in disbelief. You can't be serious. I'm dead serious, Mom. You've made it clear that you don't want our help, that you don't trust our judgment, that you'd rather risk your safety than accept that maybe, just maybe, your family knows what's best for you. So here's your opportunity to put your money where your mouth is. This is insane, Jessica. You're my daughter. You can't just abandon me at a bus station. I'm not abandoning you, she said with chilling calm. I'm giving you exactly what you've been asking for. Freedom from our interference. The chance to prove that you're still the capable, independent woman you claim to be. I fumbled for the door handle, suddenly desperate to escape this nightmare. Take me home, right now. No. Jessica's voice was flat and final. You have two choices, Mom. Get on a bus and show me you can survive on your own, or admit that you need help and agree to move to Sunny Meadows. Those are your only options. And if I refuse to choose? Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, which she pressed into my trembling hands. Then you can figure it out with this. But either way, I'm driving away from here in 10 minutes, and you're not coming with me unless you're ready to sign the papers for Sunny Meadows. I looked down at the crumpled bill in my palm, then back at my daughter's face. There was no softness there. No hint of the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, or the teenager who'd cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart. This was a woman I didn't recognize, someone capable of calculating cruelty that took my breath away. Jessica, please, don't do this. Whatever I've done to make you so angry, I'm sorry. We can work it out. It's too late for apologies, Mom. You've made your choice and now you have to live with the consequences. She reached across me and opened my door, the cold October air rushing in like a slap. 10 minutes, Mom. Bus ticket or Sunny Meadows. Decide. I climbed out of the car on unsteady legs, clutching my purse and that pathetic $20 bill. The bus station was nearly empty at this hour. Just a few tired-looking travelers slumped on plastic chairs and a bored clerk behind the ticket counter. The whole place smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights flickered. With an annoying buzz that seemed to echo the chaos in my head, Jessica rolled down her window. I'll be back here at exactly this time next week, she called out. If you're ready to be reasonable about Sunny Meadows, I'll pick you up. If not, well, I guess we'll see how independent you really are. And then she was gone, taillights disappearing into traffic, leaving me standing there with nothing but the clothes on my back and a $20 bill that might as well have been Monopoly money for all the good it would do me. At 67 years old, with arthritic knees and a heart condition that required daily medication, I'd been abandoned by my own child like a dog nobody wanted anymore. But as I stood there in that harsh fluorescent light, something unexpected began to stir inside me. Not panic, though that would come later. Not despair, though I'd certainly feel that too. What I felt in that moment was something I hadn't experienced in years. Something that had been slowly suffocated by decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. I felt angry. Not the quiet, swallowed resentment I'd carried for months, as Jessica steamrolled over my wishes, but a clean, bright fury that burned away the shock and hurt and left something harder in its place. How dare she reduce me to this? How dare she treat me like I was already dead, just an inconvenient obstacle to her perfectly planned life? I'd raised this woman from a colicky baby who never seemed to sleep, through skinned knees and broken hearts and teenage rebellion that tested every ounce of patience I possessed. I'd worked extra shifts to pay for her college, gone without new clothes for years so she could have everything she needed, supported her through her rocky early marriage when Carlos was drinking too much and the construction business was failing. I'd been there for every crisis, every celebration, every moment when she needed her mother. And this was how she repaid me. By dumping me at a bus station with $20 and an ultimatum that would make a loan shark blush. The anger felt good, cleaner than the hurt and confusion I'd been carrying. It straightened my spine and cleared my head and reminded me of something important that I'd somehow forgotten over the years. I was Margaret Thompson, and I'd survived worse things than this. I'd survived Frank's sudden death when Jessica was just starting high school, working 2 jobs while she grieved and acted out and made my life hell for 2 solid years. I'd survived the recession that nearly closed the school where I worked, learning new skills at 55 when they computerized the kitchen inventory. I'd survived 8 years of widowhood, learning to manage finances and home repairs and all, the 1,000 little things that Frank had always handled. If I could survive all that, I could certainly survive whatever Jessica thought she was putting me through. The question was, how? I looked around the bus station with new eyes, taking inventory of my situation like Frank used to do when he was planning a home improvement project. Assets, $20 cash, whatever money was in my checking account, a lifetime of practical skills, and apparently nothing left to lose. Liabilities, no place to stay, no change of clothes, medications I'd need to refill in 3 days, and a daughter who'd just demonstrated exactly how little I could count on her. The ticket clerk was watching me with mild curiosity, probably wondering why an elderly woman was standing by herself in his lobby at this hour. I approached his window with as much dignity as I could muster. "Excuse me," I said. "What destinations can I reach with $20? He consulted his computer screen, fingers clicking across the keyboard. "Well, ma'am, that depends on how far you want to go. You could get to Columbus for $18, or there's a local route that stops in Pine Lake for $15. Pine Lake? I'd heard of it, a small town about 40 miles north near the Michigan border. Frank and I had driven through it once, years ago, on our way to visit his sister in Detroit. I remembered thinking it looked peaceful, with tree-lined streets and a pretty downtown that reminded me of the town where I'd grown up. "What time does the Pine Lake bus leave?" I asked. "Next one's in about 20 minutes. Gets you there around 9:30. 9:30 at night, in a strange town where I knew nobody and had nowhere to go. Any sensible person would have called Jessica immediately and agreed to whatever she wanted. Any reasonable woman my age would have admitted defeat and accepted that maybe her daughter knew best after all. But I was discovering that after 67 years of being sensible and reasonable, I was tired of both. Jessica wanted to see if I could survive on my own? Fine. I'd show her exactly what her mother was capable of when pushed too far. "I'll take a ticket to Pine Lake," I said, sliding my $20 bill across the counter. The clerk printed "my ticket" and handed me back $5 in change, along with a receipt that might as well have been a Declaration of Independence. As I walked toward the boarding area, I caught my reflection in the station's dirty windows. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Gray hair escaping from its usual neat bun, cardigan wrinkled from the stress of the day, eyes bright with something that might have been fear or excitement or both. But she was standing straight, this woman in the window. Her chin was up, her shoulders squared. She looked like someone who'd made a decision and intended to see it through. Consequences be damned. The bus to Pine Lake wheezed to a stop outside, its door opening with a mechanical sigh that sounded like the last breath of my old life. As I climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, I thought about Jessica driving home to her family, probably already composing the story she'd tell. Carlos about how she'd finally gotten through to her stubborn mother. She had no idea that instead of breaking me, her cruelty had just set me free. For the first time in decades, I was accountable to no one but myself. I had no idea what waited for me in Pine Lake, or how I'd manage with no money and no plan and no safety net. But as the bus pulled away from the station and Riverside's lights faded behind us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility that my story wasn't over yet. Maybe, at 67, it was just beginning. The bus rumbled through the darkness like a mechanical beast, carrying me toward an uncertain future. I pressed my face against the cold window, watching familiar Ohio farmland give way to unfamiliar Michigan countryside. Streetlights became fewer and farther between until there was nothing but the occasional glow of a farmhouse window punctuating the vast blackness. My reflection stared back at me, a ghost of a woman I barely recognized anymore. The other passengers were sparse at this hour. A young man with headphones dozed in the front seat, his head bobbing with the motion of the bus. An elderly gentleman across the aisle clutched a worn leather satchel and stared straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. In the very back, a woman about my age knitted something shapeless and blue, her needles clicking in rhythm with the engine's steady hum. I reached into my purse and counted my meager resources again. $5 from the bus ticket, plus the $17.38 I'd found in my wallet. $22.38 to start a new life. The absurdity of it should have been laughable, but instead, It felt like the first honest accounting I'd done in years. No house to fall back on, no family safety net, no accumulated possessions to cushion the fall. Just me and whatever strength I could summon from within. The bus jerked to a stop at what the driver announced as Pine Lake, and I gathered my courage along with my purse. The town was smaller than I'd remembered from that long-ago drive with Frank. Main Street stretched for maybe 6 blocks, lined, with storefronts that looked like they'd been frozen in time since the 1950s. A diner called Mel's sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering pink and blue in the night. Across the street, a small hotel called the Lakeview Inn promised vacancy in hand-painted letters that had seen better days. The bus depot, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a bench under a tin awning with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Pine Lake Stop." As the bus pulled away, taking with it the last connection to my old life, I stood alone on the empty sidewalk and tried to figure out what to do next. The logical choice was the Lakeview Inn, but when I walked over and peered through the glass door, I could see a rate sign that made my heart sink. $35 a night, which meant even if I spent every penny I had, I couldn't afford 2 nights. The desk clerk, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked me up and down when I asked about their cheapest room. "We don't rent by the hour, lady," he said with a sneer that made it clear what he thought of an elderly woman showing up alone at this time of night. "I wasn't asking about hourly rates," I replied with as much dignity as I could muster. "I need a room for the night, but I'm wondering if you have any weekly rates or work exchange programs." He laughed, a sound like grinding gears. "This ain't the Salvation Army, sweetheart. Cash up front or find somewhere else to sleep." The dismissal stung, but not as much as it might have a few hours ago. Something had hardened in me during that bus ride, a protective shell forming around the soft places where Jessica's betrayal had cut deepest. I thanked him politely and walked back out into the night, determined not to let his rudeness break the fragile resolve I was building. Mel's Diner was still open, its windows glowing warmly against the October chill. Through the glass, I could see a handful of late-night diners nursing coffee and picking at pie. A bell chimed as I pushed through the door, and the smell of bacon, grease and fresh coffee wrapped around me like a hug from a friend I'd forgotten I had. The waitress behind the counter was maybe 40, with tired eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Linda, and she looked up from wiping down the coffee machine with the weary efficiency of someone who'd been working double shifts for most of her adult life. "Kitchen's closed, hun, but I can get you coffee and we've got some pie left if you're interested." I slid onto a red vinyl stool that had probably been patched and repatched a dozen times. "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you. And maybe I could ask you a question about the town?" Linda poured coffee into a thick white mug that had seen thousands of refills. "Shoot. Born and raised here, so if it's happened in Pine Lake, I probably know about it." "I'm looking for work," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "And a place to stay. Something affordable for someone starting over." She studied me with the frank curiosity of a small-town woman who'd learned to read people quickly. "Starting over at our age? That takes guts. What kind of work you looking for?" "Anything honest," I replied, and realized I meant it. I worked in a school cafeteria for 23 years back in Riverside. I can cook, clean, handle basic bookkeeping, work with children. I'm not afraid of hard work. Linda nodded approvingly. "School cafeteria. That explains the sensible shoes and the way you hold yourself. My sister worked food service for 30 years before she retired. Toughest job in the building, if you ask me." She refilled my coffee without being asked. "You running from something or toward something?" The question was so direct it took my breath away. In the fluorescent light of the diner, with this stranger who had no reason to judge me, I found myself telling the truth. Both, I think. My daughter decided I was too much trouble to deal with, so she dropped me off at the Greyhound station with $20 and told me to prove I could survive on my own. Linda's eyebrows shot up, Your own daughter did that? She thought it would teach me a lesson about accepting help. I took a sip of coffee, surprised by how good it tasted. She wanted me to move into an assisted living facility, and when I refused, she decided to show me how much I needed her. And instead, she showed you how little you need her, Linda said with a grim smile. Funny how that works sometimes. The people who think they're indispensable are often the ones we're better off without. Something in her tone suggested she spoke from experience, but I didn't pry. Instead, I asked about work opportunities in Pine Lake. Linda's expression grew thoughtful as she considered. Well, we're heading into tourist season ending, so most of the summer jobs are drying up. But Mrs. Chen, who runs the hardware store, has been looking for part-time help since her nephew went off to college. And the Methodist Church always needs someone to help with their community meals program. Pastor Roberts is good people. Might be worth talking to. She paused, studying my face. As for places to stay, the boarding house on Maple Street takes weekly rentals, but it's not fancy. Clean, though, and Mrs. Kowalski, who runs it, is fair if you are. Might be willing to work something out if you can prove you're reliable. The boarding house sounded promising, but when I asked about the cost, my heart sank again. $60 a week, plus a security deposit. Even if I could convince Mrs. Kowalski to waive the deposit, I'd need nearly 3 times what I had just for 1 week's rent. Tell you what, Linda said, apparently reading the defeat on my face. Mel's been talking about hiring someone to help with the early morning prep and cleanup. Nothing fancy, just getting here at 5 to help with breakfast setup and staying. Until after the lunch rush to handle dishes and basic maintenance. It's not much money, but it includes 2 meals a day and tips when people are feeling generous. What about tonight? I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. I don't have enough for the boarding house yet, and the hotel clerk made it clear I wasn't welcome there. Linda glanced at the clock on the wall, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of my new life. Mel's got a little apartment upstairs. Nothing fancy, just a studio with a Murphy bed and a hot plate. He's been using it for storage, but it's got running water and heat. Tell you what, you help me close up tonight and open tomorrow morning. And I'll talk to Mel about letting you stay up there until you get on your feet. The kindness from this stranger, offered so casually after the cruelty I'd endured from my own daughter, nearly broke me. I had to blink hard to keep tears from spilling over. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by proving your daughter wrong, Linda said matter-of-factly, and by being the kind of person who'd do the same for someone else someday. Mel turned out to be a gruff man in his 70s who spoke with the heavy accent of someone who'd immigrated decades ago but never quite lost the rhythms of his homeland. He looked me over with calculating eyes while Linda explained the situation, and I braced myself for another rejection. You cook? He asked finally. Yes, sir. 23 years in a school kitchen. What's your specialty? Feeding a lot. Of people good, simple food on a tight budget, I answered honestly. He grunted what might have been approval. Linda says you need work and a place to stay. I need someone who shows up on time and don't steal from me. You prove you can do the first and I won't worry about the second. Deal? The apartment upstairs was exactly as Linda had described. Tiny, cluttered with boxes of diner supplies, and about as far from my comfortable ranch house as I could imagine. But it had a bed, a working bathroom, and most importantly, it was mine, by right of honest work rather than family obligation or charity. As I cleared enough space to pull down the Murphy bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of earning my keep. The next morning came earlier than I'd expected. 5 o'clock in Pine Lake felt different from 5 o'clock in Riverside, darker somehow, and full of promise, rather than dread. I made my way downstairs to find Mel already working, his movements, efficient despite his age as he prepped vegetables and started the coffee. You're here, he said without looking up, as if he'd been testing whether I'd actually show up. I said I would be. People say lots of things. Doing them is different. He handed me an apron that had seen better days. "Coffee first, then we prep for breakfast rush. Linda will be in at 6 to handle the front while we work the kitchen." The work was harder than I'd anticipated, but familiar in its rhythms. Chopping onions, mixing pancake batter, keeping the grill clean and the coffee fresh. My hands remembered the dance of commercial food service, and my back protested only mildly as I bent over dishwashing sinks that seemed designed for someone half my age. The breakfast customers were a mix of local regulars and travelers passing through. Construction workers grabbing quick meals before job sites, retired men who gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over endless cups of coffee, and the occasional family of tourists heading to or from the lake that gave the town its name. One of the regular customers was a woman named Dorothy Williams, though everyone called her Dot. She was somewhere around my age, with silver hair that she wore in a neat bob and eyes that missed nothing. She came in every morning at exactly 7:30, ordered wheat toast and black coffee, and read the newspaper with the concentration of someone who still believed that staying informed was a civic duty. On my third day, she lingered after finishing her breakfast and approached the counter where I was refilling sugar dispensers. "You're new," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. Started Monday." "I'm Dot Williams. Been coming here for breakfast since my husband died 6 years ago. You remind me of someone, though I can't place who." "Margaret Thompson," I said, extending my hand. Most people call me Maggie. Her handshake was firm, and her eyes were kind but sharp. "You've got the look of someone who's been through something recently. Good something or bad something." The directness of small-town people was still taking some getting used to, but I was learning to appreciate it. Both, I think. Definitely something. "Well, whatever it was, you've landed in a good place. Pine Lake takes care of its own once you prove you belong here." That phrase stuck with me as the days passed. Proving I belonged. It wasn't about having the right credentials or family connections. It was about showing up every day, doing honest work, and treating people with respect. Simple concepts that had somehow gotten lost in the complicated dance of family expectations and assumed obligations back in Riverside. By the end of my first week, I'd established routines that felt surprisingly natural. Up at 4:30 to beat Mel downstairs, work the breakfast and lunch rushes, spend the afternoon either helping at the Methodist Church's food pantry or doing odd jobs around town for people who needed an extra pair of hands. Evenings I spent in my tiny apartment, reading books borrowed from the town library, or writing in a journal I'd started to help process everything that was happening to me. The money was coming in slowly but steadily. Mel paid me $75 a week plus meals, and I was averaging another 30 to 40 in tips. It wasn't much, but combined with my Social Security check that would arrive at the end of the month, it was enough to cover rent at the boarding house and start building a small emergency fund. More importantly, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for years. The woman who could charm a recipe out of the church ladies by admiring their casseroles. The problem solver who figured out how to reorganize the diner's storage system to save Mel 15 minutes every morning. The friend who listened to Linda's worries about her teenage son without offering unwanted advice. It was during my second week that I received the first call from Jessica. I was upstairs on my break when my phone rang, and her name on the display made my stomach clench. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. "Mom?" Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Where the hell are you?" "I'm in Pine Lake working," I said calmly. "Working?" "Mom, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. It's time to come home and be reasonable about Sunny Meadows." The assumption that this was all some elaborate tantrum designed to get her attention sparked a familiar anger. "I haven't made any point, Jessica. I'm simply living my life." "Living your life? In some town I've never heard of? With no family, no support system?" "Mom, this is insane. You're 67 years old. You can't just run away from reality. Reality, I repeated, tasting the word. Whose reality are we talking about? Yours, where I'm an inconvenient burden who needs to be managed? Or mine, where I'm a capable adult who can make her own decisions? There was a long pause, and when Jessica spoke again, her voice had shifted to the carefully modulated tone she used with difficult clients. Mom, I know you're angry with me. I know I handled things badly. But you have to understand, I was scared. When you fell, all I could think about was what would happen if something worse occurred and I wasn't there to help. The admission surprised me, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. Then I remembered the calculation in her eyes as she handed me that $20 bill, the coldness in her voice as she drove away from the bus station. You were scared, I said slowly. So you decided to terrorize me instead. You abandoned your own mother at a bus station to prove a point about my vulnerability. Do you see the contradiction there? I knew you'd figure something out, Jessica said defensively. You're tougher than you pretend to be. Then why do you insist I need to be warehoused in an assisted living facility? Another long pause. Because I need to know you're safe. Because I can't handle worrying about you every day on top of everything else I'm dealing with. And there it was, the truth at the heart of our conflict. It wasn't about my safety or well-being. It was about Jessica's need to control her environment, to eliminate sources of worry and uncertainty from her carefully managed life. I was supposed to sacrifice my independence for her peace of mind. I'm sorry you're worried, I said gently, but your anxiety doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without my consent. So what now? Jessica's voice cracked slightly. You're just going to stay there forever? Never see your grandchildren again? Throw away our entire relationship because I made one mistake? The pain in her voice was real, and it tugged at maternal instincts that ran deeper than anger or hurt. But I'd learned something important during my weeks in Pine Lake. Loving someone didn't mean enabling their worst impulses or sacrificing yourself for their comfort. I'm not throwing anything away, I said, but I'm also not coming back to the same situation that led to this crisis. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to have to be as equals, not as caretaker and patient. What does that mean? It means you apologize for what you did to me. Really apologize, not just explain why you thought it was necessary. It means you accept that I'm capable of making my own decisions about where and how I live. And it means you treat me with the respect you'd show any other adult. The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, Jessica said, I can't just pretend this never happened, Mom. I can't stop worrying about you living alone. I'm not asking you to stop worrying. I'm asking you to stop trying to control me because you're worried. And if I can't do that? The question hung between us, loaded with the weight of our entire relationship. I thought about Sophie and Tyler, wondered if they missed their grandmother, or if Jessica had already explained my absence in terms that painted me as the unreasonable one. I thought about all the holidays and birthdays I might miss, all the moments of their growing up that would happen without me. But then I thought about the woman I'd been becoming in Pine Lake, someone who earned her own way and made her own choices and was valued for who she was, rather than what she could provide. I thought about Dot Williams, who'd invited me to join, her book club, and Pastor Roberts, who'd asked if I'd consider helping coordinate the church's holiday food drive. I thought about Linda, who'd started asking my opinion about menu changes, and Mel, who'd grudgingly admitted that breakfast service ran smoother when I was there. Then I guess we'll both have to live with the consequences of that choice, said softly. After I hung up, I sat on my narrow bed and cried for the first time since arriving in Pine Lake. Not the bitter tears of anger and betrayal I'd shed that first night, but the deeper grief of accepting that some relationships might be broken beyond repair. That loving someone wasn't always enough to bridge the gaps created by fundamental differences in how you saw the world. But when the tears stopped, I felt something unexpected: relief. I'd spoken my truth clearly and kindly, set boundaries that protected my dignity and autonomy. Whether Jessica chose to respect those boundaries was up to her, but I'd done what I could to salvage something honest from the wreckage of our relationship. The next few days brought a steady stream of small victories that helped offset the sadness of that conversation. Mrs. Chen at the hardware store offered me 15 hours a week helping with inventory and customer service. Pastor Roberts formally asked me to coordinate the holiday food drive, a responsibility that would come with a small stipend and the satisfaction of meaningful work. Most surprisingly, the town council approached me about joining their newly formed Senior Services Committee, recognizing skills I'd developed during my years of navigating the healthcare system with Frank. Each opportunity felt like validation, proof that I was more than the burden Jessica saw when she looked at me. In Pine Lake, I wasn't someone's aging mother or inconvenient responsibility. I was Maggie Thompson, a woman with experience and skills and something valuable to contribute. The boarding house room I finally moved into was small but clean, with windows that looked out over the town's main street and a kitchenette where I could prepare simple meals. Mrs. Kowalski, the landlady, was a practical woman in her 80s who'd been widowed twice and had strong opinions about everything from proper housekeeping to foreign policy. She'd agreed to let me pay rent weekly until I got established, and in return, I helped with small maintenance tasks and kept an eye on the other residents. One of those residents was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a social worker in her 40s, who'd moved to Pine Lake after a messy divorce and a career burnout that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about helping people. We struck up a friendship over shared dinners and long conversations about starting over in middle age. "You know what I admire about what you're doing?" Elena said one evening as we sat on the boarding house's front porch watching the sunset. "You didn't just survive what your daughter did to you. You used it as a launching pad for something better." "I'm not sure I'd call it better yet," I replied honestly. "Different, certainly. Harder in some ways, easier in others." "But you're choosing it," Elena pointed out. "That's the difference between surviving and thriving. You're not just reacting to what happened to you anymore. You're actively creating the life you want." The observation stuck with me as October turned to November, and Pine Lake settled into the quiet rhythm of a small town preparing for winter. The tourist season was officially over, but that just meant the community turned inward, focusing on the networks of mutual support that would carry them through the cold months ahead. I found myself at the center of some of those networks in ways that surprised me. The Senior Services Committee met twice a month in the church basement, and my experience navigating Medicare and social services made me a valuable resource for other elderly residents facing bureaucratic challenges. The food drive I was coordinating had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with donations coming in from neighboring towns and even some of the summer tourists who'd heard about our efforts. Most unexpectedly, I'd become something of a confidant for several of the younger women in town who were struggling with aging parents of their own. They'd heard about my situation through the small-town grapevine and sought me out for advice about nursing homes and family dynamics and the guilt that came with setting boundaries with people you loved. "How do you know when you're helping and when you're enabling?" asked Sarah, a woman in her 30s whose mother called her 6 times a day with various crises and complaints. "I want to be a good daughter, but I feel like I'm drowning." The question hit close to home, and I found myself thinking carefully before answering. "I think the difference is whether your help is building someone up or just maintaining a status quo that isn't working for anyone," I said finally. "And whether you're helping because you want to or because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't." These conversations reminded me that family dysfunction wasn't unique to my situation. All over Pine Lake, and presumably all over the country, adult children and aging parents were struggling to navigate changing relationships and shifting power dynamics. Some handled it with grace and mutual respect. Others fell into patterns of control and resentment that poisoned everyone involved. I was beginning to understand that Jessica's behavior, while inexcusable, wasn't entirely incomprehensible. She'd been raised in a culture that told her she was responsible for her parents' welfare, while simultaneously devaluing the wisdom and autonomy of older adults. She'd absorbed messages about aging that painted it as nothing but decline and dependency, making it impossible for her to see strength and capability in a woman my age. That understanding didn't excuse what she'd done to me, but it did help me process my anger in more productive ways. Instead of dwelling on her cruelty, I could focus on proving those assumptions wrong, not just for her benefit, but for every older adult who'd been written off as incompetent or burdensome. By Thanksgiving, I'd been in Pine Lake for 6 weeks and felt more settled than I had in months back in Riverside. The Methodist Church was hosting a community dinner for anyone who didn't have family plans, and I'd volunteered to help coordinate the meal. It felt good to be useful in ways that went beyond fulfilling family obligations, to contribute to something larger than the narrow circle of domestic duty I'd inhabited for so long. The morning of Thanksgiving, as I stood in the church kitchen, directing volunteers and coordinating timing for a meal that would feed nearly 100 people, my phone rang. Jessica's name on the display made my stomach tighten, but I answered anyway. "Mom, it's Thanksgiving," she said without preamble. "You should be here with your family." "I am with family," I replied, looking around at the church volunteers, who'd become my chosen community. Just not the family I was born into. "Sophie and Tyler are asking about you. I don't know what to tell them." The mention of my grandchildren was a deliberate manipulation, but it still tugged at my heart. Tell them the truth, that their grandmother is building a new life where she's valued and respected. And what am I supposed to tell them when they ask why you don't want to see them anymore? The accusation was unfair, but I'd learned not to rise to Jessica's bait. You could tell them that I'd love to see them, but only if their mother is willing to treat me with basic human dignity. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," Jessica said, her tone shifting slightly. "And maybe I could have handled things differently." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than she'd come before. "How differently?" "I could have talked to you more before making decisions. Asked what you wanted instead of assuming I knew what was best." Progress, but still not acknowledgement of the fundamental violation of abandoning me at a bus station. And I shouldn't have left you there like that. It was cruel. The admission hung between us, imperfect but genuine. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that we might find a way forward, that the relationship I'd mourned might be salvageable after all. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "So will you come home for Christmas? The kids are already asking what they should put on their wish lists for Grandma." And there it was, the assumption that her partial apology had earned a return to the status quo. That I would gratefully accept her acknowledgement of wrongdoing and rush back to the role of accommodating mother and grandmother, grateful to be included again. "Jessica," I said gently, "I appreciate you calling, and I'm glad you can see that what you did was wrong. But I'm not coming back to the same situation that created this crisis. I've built a good life here, and I'm not willing to give it up. To make things easier for you." The silence that followed was so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "So this is it? You're just going to abandon your family permanently because I made one mistake?" "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said firmly. "I'm choosing to live my life on my own terms. If you want to be part of that life, you're welcome. But it will be as visitors to my home and my community, not as the center of my universe." "Your home," Jessica repeated bitterly. "You mean some boarding house in a town nobody's ever heard of." "I mean the place where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can provide. Where people respect my choices and trust my judgment. Where I'm seen as capable and contributing member of a community rather than a problem to be managed." The comparison was harsh, but necessary. Jessica needed to understand that I wasn't just hiding out in Pine Lake, licking my wounds. I was thriving in ways that had been impossible in Riverside, where our relationship had become toxic for both of us. "I have to go," I said as Linda waved at me from across the kitchen, needing help with the turkey carving. "We're serving dinner in an hour, and I have responsibilities here." "Responsibilities to strangers," Jessica said coldly. "Responsibilities to people who matter to me, and to whom I matter in return. That's what community means, Jessica. Mutual. Care and respect, not one-sided sacrifice disguised as love." After I hung up, I stood for a moment in the church kitchen, surrounded by the warm chaos of meal preparation and genuine laughter. Pastor Roberts was telling jokes that made the "why" volunteer teenagers groan. Dot Williams was directing the table setup with military precision. Elena was coordinating the childcare area where parents could drop off little ones while they helped serve. This wasn't the Thanksgiving I'd imagined 6 weeks ago, but it was. Good in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I was part of something meaningful, contributing skills and energy to a celebration that would touch the lives of people who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. I was valued not because of genetic connections or historical obligations, but because I'd proven myself useful and reliable and kind. As the first guests began arriving for dinner, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with family, duty, and everything to do with personal choice. I'd found my place in the world, and it was exactly where I was supposed to be. The phone call with Jessica had clarified something important. There was no going back to the way things had been. But that didn't mean our relationship was over forever. It just meant that any future connection would have to be built on different foundations, with boundaries that protected my newfound autonomy and dignity. Whether Jessica was capable of that kind of relationship remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, I felt truly optimistic about my future, regardless of what my family chose to do. I'd learned that survival wasn't just about having enough money or a roof over your head. It was about finding your worth in the world and refusing to let anyone diminish it, even if that someone was your own daughter. As I served Thanksgiving dinner to a room full of grateful faces, I realized that Jessica had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't just survived on my own. I'd discovered what it meant to truly live. December arrived in Pine Lake with a vengeance, bringing snow that transformed the small town into something from a holiday postcard. The storefronts along Main Street glowed with warm light from their decorated windows, and the Methodist church had strung lights around its modest steeple that twinkled against the gray winter sky. I'd never been one for excessive Christmas displays, but there was something magical about this place during the holidays that made even my practical heart flutter with unexpected joy. My routine had evolved with the season. The breakfast crowd at Mel's now included ice fishermen stopping for coffee and egg sandwiches before heading out to the frozen lake, and construction workers whose projects had shifted to indoor renovations that kept them busy despite the cold. I'd become something of a fixture behind the counter, learning the regulars' orders by heart and developing the kind of easy banter that made even the grumpiest customer crack a smile. The holiday food drive had exceeded every expectation. What started as a modest effort to help a few struggling families had grown into a county-wide initiative that would provide Christmas meals for over 200 households. Local farmers donated vegetables, the Methodist Church organized volunteer shifts, and even the Catholic Church down the street contributed their fellowship hall as additional storage space. Seeing the community come together around something I'd helped organize filled me with a pride I'd never experienced in my years of dutiful family service. Elena had taken to joining me for dinner most evenings, and our conversations had deepened beyond the superficial pleasantries of new acquaintances. She'd been a social worker in Detroit for 15 years before her divorce, and subsequent burnout had driven her to seek refuge in Pine Lake's quieter rhythms. Like me, she was learning to rebuild her identity outside the roles that had previously defined her. "You know what's interesting about your situation with Jessica?" she said one snowy evening as we shared takeout Chinese food in my small room. She couldn't have given you a better gift if she'd tried. I nearly choked on my low. In? A gift? She abandoned me at a bus station. She freed you, Elena corrected gently. Think about it. If she'd successfully pressured you into Sunny Meadows, you'd be sitting in some institutional dining room right now, eating lukewarm meatloaf and wondering where your life went. Instead, you're coordinating community programs and making real friends and proving to yourself that you're far more capable than anyone gave you credit for. The observation was both insightful and disturbing. Had I really needed something as dramatic as abandonment to find the courage to live authentically? Had I been so trapped in patterns of accommodation and service that nothing less than complete rejection could have shaken me free? Sometimes we need our worlds to fall apart before we can build them back better, Elena continued as if reading my thoughts. Jessica thought she was teaching you a lesson about dependence. Instead, she taught you about your own strength. That strength was about to be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, just as I was finishing the breakfast cleanup at Mel's. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional, and carried news that stopped my world in its tracks. Is this Margaret Thompson, mother of Jessica Martinez? Yes, who is this? This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Riverside General Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter. She's been in an accident. The details came in a rush that left me dizzy. Jessica had been driving to a showing in the early morning ice when her car hit a patch of black ice and skidded into a guardrail. She was alive but unconscious, with a serious head injury and internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. Carlos was en route from a job site 2 hours away, and the children were with neighbors, confused and frightened. She listed you as her emergency contact, Dr. Mitchell explained. We need someone here to make medical decisions if her husband doesn't arrive in time for the surgery. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter who declared me incompetent to make decisions about my own life had listed me as the person responsible for making decisions about hers. But standing in Mel's kitchen with my phone pressed to my ear, I felt none of the vindication I might have expected. Only terror at the thought of losing Jessica before we'd had a chance to heal the wounds between us. I'll be there as soon as I can, I told the doctor, already calculating bus schedules and praying I could reach Riverside in time. Mel didn't hesitate when I explained the situation. Take whatever time you need, he said gruffly, pressing $200 into my hands despite my protests. Family emergency fund. You can pay me back when you're ready. Linda drove me to the bus station, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the gravity of the situation. You'll call and let us know how she's doing? She asked as I climbed aboard the bus that would reverse the journey I'd made nearly 3 months earlier. Of course, and thank you for everything. The ride to Riverside felt both endless and too short. I used the time to call Carlos, who was beside himself with guilt about being away when the accident happened. His voice cracked as he described trying to explain to Sophie and Tyler why Mommy was in the hospital and why Daddy had to leave them with neighbors. Mrs. Thompson, I'm so glad you're coming, he said, and I could hear the tears he was trying to hold back. I don't know what we'll do if something happens to her. Nothing's going to happen to her, I said with more confidence than I felt. Jessica is strong and stubborn, and she has too much unfinished business to give up now. The bus arrived in Riverside just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. I took a taxi directly to the hospital, a building I knew well, from Frank's final weeks and my own occasional medical appointments. The familiar antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting brought back memories I'd tried to bury, but I pushed through the discomfort to focus on why I was there. Carlos was in the waiting room, still wearing his work clothes and looking like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment we just stared at each other across the space that Jessica's anger had created between us. How is she? I asked. Surgery went well. They stopped the internal bleeding, and the brain swelling is going down, but she hasn't woken up yet." His voice was hoarse from hours of worry and crying. "The doctor says the next 24 hours are critical." I sat beside him on the uncomfortable plastic chairs that hospitals seem to specialize in, and we waited together in the kind of silence that only shared fear can create. Eventually, Carlos began to talk, words spilling out like he'd been holding them back for months. "She missed you, you know. After that day at the bus station, she tried to pretend everything was fine, but I could tell she regretted it. She kept checking her phone, hoping you'd call. When Thanksgiving came and went without hearing from you, she got really depressed. The revelation was both comforting and heartbreaking. She called me on Thanksgiving. I thought she was just trying to manipulate me into coming back. Maybe at first. But lately, she'd been talking about driving up to Pine Lake to see how you were doing. She was too proud to admit she was wrong, but she knew she'd messed up." A nurse appeared to update us on Jessica's condition. Stable, but still unconscious. Showing good brain activity on the monitors, but not yet responding to external stimuli. We could see her for a few minutes if we wanted, but only one person at a time. "You go first," Carlos said immediately. "You're her mother." The woman in the hospital bed looked smaller than the Jessica who'd driven away from the bus station 3 months ago. Her face was pale and bruised, her dark hair stark against the white pillowcase. Machines beeped and hummed around her, monitoring vital signs and administering medications through tubes that made her look fragile and vulnerable in ways I'd never associated with my determined, controlling daughter. I took her hand, surprised by how cold it felt, and began to talk. Not the careful, measured words we'd exchanged in our recent phone calls, but the stream of consciousness monologue of a mother watching over her sleeping child. "I'm here, sweetheart. Carlos called me, and I came as fast as I could. The doctors say you're going to be fine, but you need to wake up so we can have that conversation we've been avoiding. There's so much I need to tell you about Pine Lake, about the life I've built there. Good things, Jessica. Things that would make you proud if you'd let yourself see them." I told her about Mel's gruff kindness and Linda's quick friendship. About the food drive and the senior services committee and the small but meaningful ways I'd found to contribute to my new community. I described my tiny room at the boarding house, the view of Main Street from my window, the satisfaction of earning my own way through honest work. "You were wrong about me being helpless," I said softly, stroking her hand. "But you were right about one thing. I am stronger than I pretended to be. Strong enough to survive what you did to me, and strong enough to forgive you for it if you're willing to meet me halfway." The machines continued their electronic vigil, and Jessica remained still and silent. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, holding my daughter's hand and talking to her unconscious form, I felt something shift between us. The anger and hurt that had dominated our recent interactions began to fade, replaced by the deeper love that had somehow survived beneath all the conflict and misunderstanding. Carlos appeared in the doorway, and I realized I'd been talking for nearly an hour. "The kids are here," he said quietly. "They wanted to see her before visiting hours end." Sophie and Tyler looked shell-shocked as they entered the room, their usual teenage composure cracked by fear and uncertainty. Sophie, now 16 and looking more like Jessica every day, immediately burst into tears at the sight of her mother hooked up to all those machines. Tyler, 14 and trying to be the man of the family, stood frozen at the foot of the bed until I opened my arms, and he fell into them like he was 8 years old again. "Is she going to die, Grandma?" he whispered against my shoulder. "No, sweetheart. She's going to be fine. The doctors fixed everything that was broken, and now she just needs time to rest and heal." "But what if she doesn't wake up? What if she's like this forever?" It was Sophie who answered, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders in a gesture so reminiscent of Jessica that it took my breath away. "She's going to wake up because she's too stubborn to stay asleep. And when she does, we're all going to be here waiting for her." We took turns sitting with Jessica throughout the night, a family vigil that felt both familiar and strange after months of separation and conflict. Carlos dozed fitfully in the chair beside her bed, jerking awake every time a machine beeped, or a nurse came in to check her vitals. The kids curled up on the small couch under hospital blankets, exhausted by emotion and the late hour. I found myself keeping watch during the quiet hours before dawn, when the hospital settled into its overnight rhythm, and the only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the distant footsteps of night shift nurses. It gave me time to think about what would happen when Jessica woke up, how we might navigate the changed landscape of our relationship. The old dynamics were gone, that much was clear. I couldn't go back to being the accommodating mother who swallowed her opinions to keep peace, and Jessica would have to accept that I'd built a life that didn't revolve around her needs and expectations. But sitting there in the pale glow of medical equipment, watching my daughter's chest rise and fall with steady breaths, I felt hopeful that we might find something better to replace what had been lost. The breakthrough came just after sunrise. I was reading aloud from a magazine I'd found in the waiting room, describing a travel article about small towns in Michigan, when Jessica's fingers twitched in mine. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then her eyelids fluttered and she made a small sound that had me frantically pushing the call button for the nurse. "Mom?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay." Her eyes found mine, confused and unfocused, but definitely aware. "The accident. I remember hitting the ice. Oh God, the kids. They're fine. They're here, sleeping, on the couch. Carlos is here too. Everyone's fine, and you're going to be fine." The relief on her face was followed quickly by a flash of something else. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, as if she'd expected to wake up alone. "You came back." "Of course I came back. You're my daughter." Tears started streaming down her cheeks, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I was scared and angry, and I handled everything wrong." "Shh. We can talk about all that later. Right now, you just need to rest and get better." But Jessica gripped my hand with surprising strength, as if she was afraid I might disappear again. "No, I need to say this now. What I did to you was unforgivable. Leaving you at that bus station like you were nothing, like everything you'd done for our family meant nothing. I was so focused on being right about what you needed that I couldn't see what you wanted." "Jessica, please, let me finish. I've had 3 months to think about this, and I know I was wrong. Not just about the bus station, but about everything. About treating you like you were incompetent. About making decisions without including you. About seeing you as a problem instead of a person." The words I'd longed to hear were finally being spoken, but the context robbed them of any satisfaction. My daughter lying in a hospital bed, apologizing through tears and pain medication, wasn't how I'd imagined our reconciliation. "I need you to know something," I said gently. "What you did was terrible, and it hurt me more than I can describe. But it also set me free in ways you can't imagine. I've built a good life in Pine Lake, Jessica. A life where I'm valued and respected and useful. I'm not the same woman you left at that bus station." Fear flickered across her face. "Does that mean you won't come back? That you can't forgive me?" "It means I won't come back to the same relationship we had before. I won't be the convenient grandmother who drops everything when you need help, or the future inheritance you're planning around, or the problem you need to solve for your own peace of mind." She nodded slowly, wincing as the movement aggravated her head injury. "I understand, and I deserved that. But maybe we could start over, build something better. I'd like that, but it will have to be on different terms. Whatever terms you want. I don't want to lose you completely." Carlos stirred in his chair as the morning shift change brought new nurses and a resident doctor to check on Jessica's progress. The kids woke up gradually, their faces transforming from sleepy confusion to joy as they realized their mother was awake and talking. "Mom!" Sophie rushed to the bedside, carefully avoiding the various tubes and wires. "We were so scared." "I'm okay, baby. Everything's going to be okay." Tyler hung back slightly, still processing the emotional whiplash of the last 24 hours. I caught his eye and smiled, and he managed a watery grin in return. These children had been through enough trauma without having to navigate the complicated adult emotions surrounding their grandmother's estrangement from their mother. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about Jessica's recovery. The brain swelling had subsided, and her cognitive functions appeared to be intact. She'd need several days in the hospital for observation, followed by weeks of rest and physical therapy, but the prognosis was good for a full recovery. As the immediate crisis passed, the practical questions began to surface. Carlos would need to take time off work to care for Jessica and manage the household. The kids would need emotional support as they processed their mother's brush with mortality. And I would need to decide how long to stay in Riverside and what role, if any, I wanted to play in their lives going forward. "I should call work and let them know what's happening," I told Carlos during a quiet moment in the hallway. "They're expecting me back, but with Jessica's condition..." "Stay as long as you need to," he said immediately. "I know things have been complicated between you and Jess, but having you here, it means everything to the kids. And to me, too." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep in my chest. Carlos had always been caught in the middle of the conflicts between Jessica and me, trying to maintain peace while supporting his wife's decisions. To hear him express genuine gratitude for my presence was healing in ways I hadn't expected. "I'll stay through the weekend," I decided. "Make sure she's stable and help with whatever you need. But then I need to get back to Pine Lake. I have responsibilities there, people counting on me." It felt strange to say that, to prioritize obligations to my chosen community over family crisis. The old Maggie would have dropped everything indefinitely, would have moved back into my old house to care for Jessica and manage the household until she was fully recovered. But that woman had died somewhere between the bus station and my first morning at Mel's Diner. The new Maggie had commitments. That mattered. Work that provided both income and identity. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than blood obligation. I could help my family through this crisis, but I wouldn't sacrifice the life I'd built to do it. Jessica seemed to understand this when I explained my decision. "I'm grateful you came at all," she said, her voice still weak, but her eyes clearer than they'd been since the accident. "And I'm proud of you for building something meaningful in Pine Lake. I want to hear more about it when I'm feeling better." The request surprised me. "You really want to know about my new life?" "I want to know about you, Mom. The real you, not just the version of you that existed to take care of our family. I think I lost sight of the fact that you're a whole person with your own dreams and goals and needs." It was the most insightful thing Jessica had said to me in years, and it gave me hope that we might indeed be able to build something better from the ruins of our old relationship. I spent the next 3 days splitting my time between the hospital and my old house, which felt like visiting a museum of someone else's life. The furniture was the same. The family photos still lined the hallway, but the woman who'd lived there felt like a stranger to me now. I packed a few more personal items to take back to Pine Lake, but left most everything as it was. This wasn't my home anymore, and that was perfectly fine with me. The most meaningful conversation happened on my last evening in Riverside. Jessica was feeling well enough to sit up and eat real food, and the kids were busy with homework in the hospital's family lounge. Carlos had gone home to shower and change clothes, leaving us alone for the first honest conversation we'd had in years. "I keep thinking about that day," Jessica said quietly. Driving away from the bus station and seeing you in the rearview mirror, you looked so small and lost, and I felt this terrible moment of doubt about what I was doing. But you kept driving. I kept driving because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. Because I'd convinced myself that being cruel was somehow kinder than letting you make what I thought was a mistake. I considered this, recognizing the twisted logic that had driven so many of our conflicts. You thought you were saving me? From myself. I thought I knew better than you what you needed. And I was terrified of watching you get hurt or struggle when I believed I could prevent it. By taking away my right to make my own choices. Jessica nodded, tears starting to flow again. I realize now how arrogant that was. How disrespectful. You raised me, took care of Dad through his illness, managed on your own for 8 years after he died. Of course you were capable of making decisions about your own life. I'm glad you can see that now. But Jessica, I need you to understand something important. Even if I had made mistakes, even if I had struggled, that would have been my right. Failure is part of being human, and protecting someone from all possibility of failure isn't protection at all. It's control disguised as love. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and I realized I'd articulated something she'd probably never consciously acknowledged. Her need to manage and control hadn't been motivated by malice, but it had been just as damaging as intentional. Cruelty. How do I fix this? She asked. How do we move forward? By respecting each other as equals. By accepting that we're both adults capable of making our own decisions, even when those decisions worry or inconvenience the other person. By building a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. And if I struggle with that? If my instinct is still to try to manage things? Then you work on changing those instincts. And I'll work on speaking up when I feel like my autonomy is being threatened instead of swallowing my resentment until it poisons everything between us. We talked until the nurses came to prepare Jessica for sleep, covering months of hurt and misunderstanding with an honesty that felt both painful and liberating. There were no promises of instant transformation, no dramatic declarations of perfect understanding. Just two women who loved each other, acknowledging the ways they'd failed each other and committing to do better. When I left Riverside the next morning, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything was finally honest. Jessica and I had a foundation to build on now, one that acknowledged both our love for each other and our need to exist as separate, autonomous individuals. The bus ride back to Pine Lake felt like a journey home, rather than an escape. I watched the familiar countryside roll past and thought about the community waiting for me, the work I'd left undone, the life I'd chosen for myself. In a few hours, I'd be back in Mel's kitchen, joking with Linda and serving coffee to regulars who knew my name and valued my presence. I'd resume coordination of the holiday food drive, help with the senior services committee, and continue building the authentic existence I'd discovered in the wake of abandonment. Jessica would recover, and slowly, carefully, we'd figure out how to be family to each other in ways that honored both our connection and our independence. The kids would visit Pine Lake eventually, and maybe Jessica and Carlos would too, when she was ready to see the life I'd built rather than mourning the mother she'd lost. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks and misunderstandings along the way. But for the first time in months, I felt genuinely optimistic about our future. Sometimes the most destructive acts of love create space for something healthier, to grow. Sometimes losing everything allows you to discover what truly matters. As the bus pulled into Pine Lake's modest station, I could see Linda waiting for me with a thermos of coffee and a smile that said, "Welcome home." Behind her, the town stretched along the lakeshore, ordinary and beautiful and mine in ways that had nothing to do with legal ownership and everything to do with belonging. I gathered my small bag and prepared to step back into the life that rejection had forced me to create, grateful for both the daughter who'd driven me to discover my own strength and the community that had helped me claim it. Spring arrived in Pine Lake with a burst of wildflowers that transformed the town's modest landscape into something that belonged on a postcard. The harsh winter had tested everyone's resolve, but as the ice melted from the lake and the first crocuses pushed through the thawing ground, there was a sense of renewal that seemed to touch every corner of the community. I'd been in Pine Lake for 8 months now, long enough to witness the full cycle of seasons and to understand that I'd found something more precious than I'd ever dared to hope for, a place where I truly belonged. The holiday food drive had been such a success that the town council asked me to coordinate year-round assistance programs for struggling families. What started as a temporary assignment born from crisis had evolved into meaningful work that utilized decades of experience I hadn't even realized I possessed. Managing the school cafeteria had taught me about nutrition and food safety, but it had also given me skills in logistics, volunteer coordination, and working with people from all walks of life. In Pine Lake, those abilities were valued rather than taken for granted. My relationship with Jessica had evolved slowly over the winter months. She'd made a full recovery from her accident, though the experience had changed her in subtle but important ways. The woman who'd once approached every problem with bulldozer determination now seemed more thoughtful, more willing to consider perspectives other than her own. We talked every few weeks, conversations that focused more on daily life than family obligations, and gradually the artificial distance between us had given way to something that felt more genuine. The first test of our new dynamic came in February, when Jessica called with news that Tyler had been accepted to a competitive summer program for young musicians. The program was expensive, beyond what Carlos and Jessica could afford with their current financial pressures, and in the past, this would have been the moment when they turned to me for help. I braced myself for the familiar request, the assumption that solving their financial problems was my responsibility as the family matriarch. But Jessica surprised me. "I wanted to let you know because I'm proud of him, and I thought you'd want to hear the good news," she said simply. "We're working on the funding through scholarships and maybe a payment plan, but Tyler's so excited about the opportunity." The absence of any ask, any hint that I should offer to cover the costs, was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. Had I been so conditioned to being needed financially that I felt disappointed when my help wasn't requested? "That's wonderful news," I replied, genuinely happy for my grandson's achievement. Tyler's always been musical. I remember him humming complex melodies when he was barely old enough to talk. "He gets that from Dad," Jessica said, referring to Frank with a warmth that surprised me. "Remember how he used to play guitar on the front porch during summer evenings?" We spent the rest of the conversation sharing memories of Frank's love for music, a connection that felt natural and unforced. When we hung up, I realized we'd talked for 20 minutes without a single moment of tension or underlying resentment. Progress, slow but real. A few days later, I found myself at the bank in Pine Lake, making arrangements to transfer money for Tyler's summer program. Not because Jessica had asked, but because I wanted to contribute to my grandson's education in a way that honored both his talent and my autonomy. When I called to let Jessica know about the gift, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, you don't have to do this. We'll figure something out." "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference." Another pause. "Thank you. Not just for the money, but for the way you're doing this. No strings, no lectures about what we should have done differently. Just generosity because you love Tyler." "That's what family should be," I said. "Choosing to help because you want to, not because you're obligated or manipulated into it." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Jessica began calling more frequently, sharing both good news and struggles without the underlying agenda that had poisoned our interactions for years. When Carlos's construction business landed a major contract, she called to celebrate. When Sophie was struggling with college applications and anxiety, she called for advice about supporting a stressed teenager. These weren't emergencies requiring my immediate intervention, just the normal give and take of family members who cared about each other's lives. The most significant conversation came in early April, when Jessica called with a request that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in visitors over Memorial Day weekend," she said tentatively. "The kids have been asking about Pine Lake, and I thought maybe it was time I saw what you've built there." The invitation represented a fundamental shift in our dynamic. Instead of expecting me to return to their world on their terms, Jessica was proposing to enter my world as a guest. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. "I'd love that," I said, already mentally planning how to show them the life I'd created. "Fair warning, though, you'll be staying at the Lakeview Inn, and you'll be expected to help serve breakfast at the Methodist Church's community meal on Sunday." Jessica laughed, a sound I'd rarely heard during our darkest period. "Putting us to work, huh? I think we can handle that." The weeks leading up to their visit were filled with a nervous energy I hadn't felt since my early days in Pine Lake. I wanted Jessica and the kids to see not just the physical space I inhabited, but the community I'd become part of, the meaningful work I was doing, the person I'd become when freed from the constraints of their expectations. Elena helped me plan activities that would showcase Pine Lake's charm without overwhelming city teenagers who might find small-town life boring. Dot Williams offered to host a book club meeting so Jessica could meet some of the women who'd become my closest friends. Pastor Roberts suggested that Tyler might enjoy helping with the church's music program, which had grown significantly under the direction of a retired opera singer who'd moved to Pine Lake the previous fall. Mel grumbled about having tourists disrupt his kitchen routine, but I caught him polishing the coffee machine with unusual care and adding items to the menu that he thought teenagers might enjoy. Linda organized a shift schedule that would allow me time off during their visit, and Mrs. Kowalski at the boarding house made sure the inn's rooms were in perfect condition. The preparations revealed something important about the community I'd found. These people weren't just being polite to an elderly resident's visiting family. They genuinely cared about making a good impression because they cared about me. I'd earned their respect and affection through 8 months of reliable friendship and hard work, and they wanted to share in my happiness about being reunited with my daughter and grandchildren. When the day finally arrived, I found myself standing at the same bus station where my new life had begun, waiting for Jessica's rental car to appear on Main Street. The symbolism of meeting them here, at the place where my journey toward independence had started, felt both intentional and right. This time, I wasn't a discarded woman with $20 and nowhere to go. I was a respected member of the community, greeting beloved family members on my own territory. Jessica looked older than I remembered, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and worry weathered and overcome. But there was something softer about her expression, a openness that hadn't been there during our years of conflict. Sophie had grown taller and more confident, carrying herself with the poise of a young woman rather than an uncertain teenager. Tyler had his father's easy smile and his grandfather's musical hands, fingers that seemed to be constantly tapping out rhythms on whatever surface was available. "Grandma!" Sophie's embrace nearly knocked me over, and for a moment I was overwhelmed by how much I'd missed these simple expressions of uncomplicated love. Tyler was more reserved, as befitted his 14-year-old dignity, but his hug was warm and genuine. "This place is smaller than I expected," he said, looking around at Pine Lake's modest downtown. "Good things often come in small packages," I replied, ruffling his hair in a gesture that made him grin despite himself. Jessica approached more cautiously, as if she wasn't entirely sure of her welcome despite our phone conversations and my invitation. When I opened my arms to her, she stepped into the embrace with visible relief. "Thank you for letting us come," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see us in your new space." "Your space too, if you want it to be," I replied, meaning it more than she probably realized. I'd planned a walking tour of Pine Lake's highlights, but the kids were immediately drawn to the lake itself, its surface sparkling in the late afternoon sun We spent the first hour just sitting on the small beach, watching boats return from day trips and listening to Tyler identify the different bird calls echoing across the water. It was peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with planned activities or forced conversation. "It's beautiful here," Jessica said, seeming genuinely surprised. I expected something more. Depressing, I guess. Like you'd chosen the most remote place you could find to punish us. "I chose the place where I could be happy," I corrected gently. Punishment was never the goal. Survival was. That evening, I took them to Mel's for dinner, nervous about how they'd react to the simple diner that had become so central to my daily life. Mel, predictably, was gruff with the newcomers, but I caught him watching Tyler with interest when my grandson mentioned his acceptance to the summer music program. "Classical or popular?" Mel asked, his accent thickening with what I'd learned was genuine curiosity rather than dismissal. "Both, I guess. I play piano and guitar, but I want to learn composition. My nephew in Detroit, he teaches music at the university. Good program there if you're serious about composition." The conversation that followed revealed a side of Mel I'd only glimpsed in 8 months of working together. His family had immigrated from Poland when he was young, and music had been their connection to both their homeland and their new country. He'd given up his own musical ambitions to run the family restaurant, but his love for the art form had never diminished. Linda joined us during her break, charming Sophie with stories about her own daughter's college experiences and offering practical advice about managing academic stress. Before long, both kids were laughing at Linda's jokes and asking questions about life in Pine Lake. Jessica watched these interactions with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been envy. "They really care about you," she said, later as we walked back toward the inn. "And I care about them. That's how friendship works when it's freely chosen rather than obligated." The next day, I showed them the food pantry and community meal program I coordinated, explaining how the network of support functioned and introducing them to some of the volunteers who'd become essential partners. Elena was there, helping sort donations, and she and Jessica struck up an immediate conversation about the challenges of starting over in middle age. "Your mother is something of a local hero," Elena told Sophie and Tyler while Jessica and I were discussing logistics. With Pastor Roberts, she took a program that was helping maybe 20 families and turned it into something that serves the entire county. Sophie beamed with pride that warmed my heart. "That's so cool, Grandma. I had no idea you were doing all this." "Neither did I until I got here," I admitted. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until circumstances force us to find out. Tyler had gravitated toward the church's piano, where he was carefully picking out a melody that caught Pastor Roberts' attention. Within minutes, they were deep in conversation about the church's music program and the upcoming spring concert. Watching my grandson connect with people who mattered to me felt like watching two important parts of my life finally merge. The most challenging moment came Saturday evening, when Jessica and I found ourselves alone on the inn's small porch, while the kids explored the town's modest nightlife. She'd been unusually quiet during dinner, and I could sense something weighing on her mind. "I owe you more than an apology," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I owe you acknowledgement of something I've been too ashamed to admit." I waited, giving her the space to find her words. "When I left you at that bus station, part of me hoped you'd fail. Part of me wanted you to be forced to call me, begging to come back and agree to Sunny Meadows. I wanted to be right about you needing me, about me knowing better than you what was best for your life. The honesty was brutal but necessary. And instead, you succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined. You built a life that's richer and more meaningful than anything you had in Riverside. You found people who value you for who you are, work that utilizes your skills, a community where you matter." Tears were streaming down her face now, years of guilt and regret finally finding release. I robbed you of years of this kind of happiness because I was too controlling and fearful to let you make your own choices. I kept you trapped in a role that was too small for who you really are. Jessica, you didn't rob me of anything. You freed me to discover who I could become when I wasn't defined by other people's needs and expectations. How can you be so generous about what I did to you? Because holding on to anger would poison the life I've built here, and because you're not the same person who drove away from that bus station. People can change, grow, become better versions of themselves. Look at what you've become in the months since your accident. She wiped her eyes, smiling through the tears. What have I become? Someone who can admit when she's wrong, someone who can see beyond her own perspective, someone who's learning to love without trying to control. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over Pine Lake, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the water like a blessing. Tomorrow they would leave, but something fundamental had shifted between us during this visit. Jessica had seen the life I'd created, met the people who'd become my chosen family, witnessed firsthand that my choice to stay in Pine Lake wasn't about rejecting them, but about embracing myself. Sunday morning brought the community breakfast, where Jessica and the kids had volunteered to help serve. Watching my daughter learn the rhythm of the serving line, chatting with regulars about their families and health concerns, I saw flashes of the compassionate young woman she'd been before. Life's pressures had made her so controlling and fearful. Sophie proved to be a natural with the elderly diners, patient with their stories, and gentle with those whose arthritis made handling utensils difficult. Tyler charmed everyone by playing piano during the meal, his improvisations on familiar hymns adding unexpected joy to the gathering. Your family is lovely, Dot Williams told me as we cleaned up afterward. I can see where you get your strength and kindness. Actually, I think I'm finally discovering where they get theirs, I replied, watching Jessica laugh at something Pastor Roberts had said while Tyler helped stack chairs with efficient enthusiasm. The goodbye at the bus station was emotional, but not desperate. There were tears, but they were the tears of people who knew they'd see each other again, who'd found a way to love each other without losing themselves in the process. When can we come back? Sophie asked, hugging me tightly. Whenever you want, as long as you give me some notice to arrange time off work, I replied, and the casual way I referred to my responsibilities here seemed to delight her. I want to learn to fish, Tyler declared, and maybe help with the music program this summer if that's okay. More than okay. Pastor Roberts would be thrilled to have your help. Jessica's goodbye was longer and more complex, weighted with all the history between us and all the hope for our future. I'm proud of you, Mom, she said simply. Proud of your courage, your resilience, your ability to build something beautiful from such an ugly beginning. I'm proud of you too, for being brave enough to visit, to see me in my new context, to let go of the version of me that existed only to serve your needs. Will you visit us in Riverside sometime? Not to stay, just to visit? I'd like that, when Tyler's home from his summer program maybe. I want to hear about his experiences. As their car disappeared around the corner that led to the highway, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with family duty fulfilled and everything to do with authentic connection freely chosen. They'd come to Pine Lake as visitors to my world rather than demanding that I return to theirs. They'd met my friends, seen my work, understood the life I'd created for myself. Most importantly, they'd respected my choice to stay. Linda found me standing by the lake that evening, watching the water reflect the last light of day. Good visit? She asked, settling beside me on the weathered bench that had become my favorite thinking spot. Better than I dared hope. They saw who I've become here, and they liked her. Of course they did. She's pretty amazing. The simple affirmation from this woman who'd become one of my dearest friends felt like a benediction on the journey I'd taken from abandoned mother to self-determined woman. In 8 months, I'd rebuilt not just my living situation, but my entire sense of identity and worth. Elena joined us a few minutes later, carrying 3 cups of coffee from Mel's and the easy assumption of welcome that marked our deepest friendships. So, verdict on the family visit? Successful reconciliation without compromise of principles, I replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. The holy grail of family relationships, Elena laughed. How'd you manage it? By refusing to go, back to who I used to be, and by giving them space to become who they're capable of being. As we sat together watching stars appear over the lake, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that awful night at the Greyhound station. Jessica's cruelty had forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, to build a community based on mutual respect rather than obligation, to find work that utilized skills I'd accumulated over decades of service to others. The woman who'd been abandoned with $20 and nowhere to go had become someone who coordinated county-wide assistance programs, who was respected for her experience and judgment, who had genuine friends and meaningful work, and a place in the world that was entirely her own creation. More importantly, I'd learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between duty-bound love and freely chosen affection, between surviving and thriving. Jessica's visit had confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Sometimes the most destructive acts of supposed love create space for something healthier and more authentic to grow. Tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythms of my chosen life. Morning coffee with Mel before the breakfast rush, coordination meetings for summer assistance programs, evening conversations with friends who valued my opinions and respected my choices. A life built on my own terms, accountable to people who saw me as capable and contributing rather than burdensome and declining. Jessica and the kids would return to Riverside with stories about Pine Lake, about the community I'd found and the work I was doing. They'd carry with them a new understanding of who I was when freed from the constraints of their expectations, and perhaps that understanding would influence how they treated other elderly people in their lives. But whether it did or not, I was no longer dependent on their approval or acceptance for my sense of worth. I'd learned to validate myself through honest work and authentic relationships, to find meaning in contribution rather than sacrifice, to love without losing myself in the process. The phone call that would test this hard-won independence came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was cleaning tables at Mel's after the breakfast rush when my phone rang with Jessica's number. Something in my stomach clenched at the unexpected timing. Jessica usually called in the evenings when she had time to talk without work interruptions. "Mom," her voice was tight with stress, "we need to talk." The tension in Jessica's voice sent my mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. Had Carlos been injured on a job site? Was one of the kids in trouble? Had her accident caused delayed complications that the doctors had missed? "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my cleaning cloth and moving toward the relative privacy of Mel's small office. "Carlos lost the Miller contract, the big one that was supposed to carry us through the rest of the year. The client decided to go with a larger company at the last minute, and now we're looking at a massive financial shortfall." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old pattern of family crisis triggering my rescue instincts. But something had changed in me during these months in Pine Lake. Instead of immediately offering solutions or diving into problem-solving mode, I found myself asking a different question. "I'm sorry to hear that. What are you planning to do?" The pause that followed told me Jessica had expected a different response. In the past, this would have been the moment when I offered to help financially, when we would have discussed how much money they needed and how I could provide it. The absence of that automatic offer hung between us like a challenge. "We're exploring our options," Jessica said carefully. "Carlos is bidding on some smaller projects, and I'm picking up extra showings. We might need to refinance the house, or look into a business loan." "Those sound like reasonable approaches," I replied, meaning it. "Difficult situations, but you're both resourceful people." Another pause. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm not calling to ask you for money. I know our relationship is different now, and I respect that you have your own life and financial obligations." The words should have been reassuring, but something in Jessica's tone suggested there was more to this conversation. But Tyler's summer program requires a deposit by Friday, and we're not going to be able to cover it with everything else going on. I wanted to let you know that he might have to withdraw from the program. There it was, the subtle manipulation disguised as information sharing. Jessica wasn't directly asking for help, but she was presenting a situation where my financial intervention could solve a problem that would disappoint my grandson. It was a more sophisticated version of the guilt-based requests that had characterized our relationship for years. The old Maggie would have immediately offered to cover the deposit, probably along with additional funds to help with their general financial crisis. The new Maggie recognized the pattern and chose to respond differently. "That's disappointing for Tyler," I said. "How is he handling the news?" "We haven't told him yet. We're hoping something will work out before we have to." "I see. Well, I hope you find a solution that works for your family's budget." The silence that followed was loaded with Jessica's surprise and perhaps disappointment. I could almost hear her recalibrating, trying to decide whether to be more direct in her request or to accept that the conversation wasn't going as she'd planned. "The thing is," she said finally, "you mentioned before that you wanted to contribute to Tyler's education. I thought maybe this could be one of those times." And there it was, the direct ask wrapped in the language of my own previous generosity. It was skillfully done, and it might have worked if I hadn't spent the last 8 months learning to distinguish between authentic connection and emotional manipulation. "Jessica, I did offer to help with Tyler's education, and I followed through on that offer. The summer program is fully funded through the gift I made in February. But with Carlos losing the contract, we had to use some of that money for emergency expenses. I know it wasn't what you intended it for, but we didn't have any other choice." The admission hit me like a physical blow. The money I'd specifically designated for Tyler's musical education had been diverted to cover other family expenses, without any discussion or consultation with me. It was exactly the kind of assumption about my resources and role that had poisoned our relationship for years. "So the money I gave you for Tyler's program is gone," I said quietly. "Not gone exactly. We'll pay it back when Carlos gets another big contract. This is just temporary." "Jessica, that money was a gift for a specific purpose. It wasn't a loan or an emergency fund for your family's use. I know, and I'm sorry, but you have to understand, we were desperate. The mortgage payment was due, and Tyler's program seemed less important than keeping the house." The justification revealed so much about how Jessica still viewed my role in their lives. My gifts were considered part of their general resources, available for reallocation based on their changing priorities. The fact that I'd specifically wanted to support Tyler's musical development was less important than their immediate financial. "I understand you were in a difficult position," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But using money designated for Tyler's education without discussing it with me was wrong. It shows that you still see me as a financial resource rather than as a person whose wishes deserve respect. That's not fair. You're making this sound like we stole from you. You took money I gave for a specific purpose and used it for something else without asking my permission. What would you call that?" The question hung between us, and I could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath. "I called to share what was happening in our lives and to see if you might be able to help. I didn't expect to be lectured about how we manage our finances. And I didn't expect to learn that a gift I made in good faith had been repurposed without my knowledge or consent." We were sliding back into the old pattern of conflict, and I recognized that this conversation was about much more than Tyler's summer program. It was a test of the new boundaries I'd established, a challenge to see whether the changes in our relationship were real or just temporary accommodations to unusual circumstances. "So what now?" Jessica asked, her voice sharp with frustration. Tyler loses his opportunity because we made a mistake? Tyler loses his opportunity because you chose to use his education money for other purposes. That was your decision, and these are the natural consequences of that choice. You could fix this with one phone call to your bank. Tyler would never have to know what happened. And what would that teach any of us? That actions don't have consequences? That I'm responsible for solving problems created by your financial decisions? It would teach us that family supports each other in difficult times. No, Jessica. It would teach you that I'm still the family ATM, available to bail you out whenever your planning falls short. That's not support. That's enabling. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of 8 months of hard-won self-respect. I'd learned the difference between helping and enabling, between love and obligation, between supporting someone and allowing them to avoid the consequences of their choices. So you're going to let your grandson suffer because you want to teach his parents a lesson? The accusation was designed to trigger my guilt, to make me second-guess the boundaries I'd established. In the past, it would have worked. The thought of Tyler's disappointment would have overridden my concerns about family dynamics and financial responsibility. But I'd learned something important during my time in Pine Lake. Protecting people from the natural consequences of their choices wasn't actually protection at all. It was a form of control that prevented them from learning and growing and developing their own resilience. I'm not causing Tyler to suffer. You are, by choosing to use his education money for other purposes. I'm simply refusing to rescue you from the consequences of that choice. This isn't who you used to be, Mom. The mother I knew would have done anything to help her family. The mother you knew sacrificed her own well-being to enable her family's poor planning and financial irresponsibility. I won't be that person anymore. The conversation ended badly, with Jessica hanging up after accusing me of becoming cold and selfish. I sat in Mel's office for several minutes afterward, shaking with adrenaline and second-guessing every word I'd spoken. Had I been too harsh? Was I allowing my hurt over their past treatment to prevent me from helping when they genuinely needed it? Linda found me there an hour later, still sitting with my phone in my hand and confusion written across my face. "Rough call?" she asked gently. I explained the situation, laying out the details of Jessica's request and my response. Linda listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions but offering no immediate advice. When I finished, she was quiet. For a moment. "Sounds like you stuck to your principles," she said finally. "That's not always easy when family's involved." But what if I'm wrong? What if Tyler really does miss this opportunity because I'm being stubborn about boundaries? Maggie, you gave them money specifically for Tyler's program. They chose to use it for something else. The program Tyler's missing isn't because of your stubbornness. It's because of their choices. The simple clarity of Linda's perspective helped cut through the emotional fog that Jessica's call had created. I'd been manipulated into feeling responsible for solving a problem I hadn't created, for fixing consequences that resulted from decisions I hadn't made. Elena, when I told her about the situation that evening, was more direct in her assessment. "Classic manipulation," she said bluntly. "Create a crisis, present you as the only solution, then make you feel guilty for not fixing problems you didn't cause. But they are family. Don't I have some obligation to help when they're struggling? You had an obligation to help Tyler with his education, and you fulfilled that obligation. What they did with your help after that was their choice. You're not obligated to keep giving until they've solved all their problems." It feels harsh. Boundaries always feel harsh to people who are used to crossing them, Elena replied. But the alternative is going back to being the family emergency fund, available whenever someone else's planning falls short. The wisdom in her words was undeniable, but the emotional weight of the situation was harder to process. That night, I lay awake thinking about Tyler's disappointment when he learned about the program, imagining Jessica's version of events where I was cast as the grandmother who could have helped but chose not to. The call I'd been dreading came 2 days later. This time it was Carlos, his voice heavy with embarrassment and frustration. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to apologize for what Jessica told you about Tyler's program money. I didn't know she'd used it for other expenses until after she talked to you." The admission surprised me. "You didn't know?" "She handles most of our finances, and when she said the mortgage was covered, I didn't ask where the money came from. If I'd known it was Tyler's education fund, I would never have agreed to it." Carlos had always been the more reasonable of the two, more aware of boundaries, and less likely to assume that family obligations extended to unlimited financial support. His embarrassment seemed genuine. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "But the damage is done. Tyler's program deposit was due yesterday." "I know. We told him last night that he wouldn't be able to attend. He took it better than we expected, but I could see how disappointed he was." The image of my grandson trying to hide his disappointment tugged at my heart, but I forced myself to remember the larger principle at stake. "I'm sorry Tyler has to experience this disappointment, but maybe it's a lesson about the importance of keeping commitments and managing resources responsibly. Maybe. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that I don't expect you to fix this. Jessica thinks you should, but I understand why you won't. We made our choice when we used that money for other things." Carlos's acceptance of responsibility was such a contrast to Jessica's manipulation that it almost made me reconsider my position. Almost. "Thank you for understanding. And Carlos? In the future, if I make a gift for a specific purpose, I'd appreciate it if you'd make sure it's used for that purpose. You have my word on that." After Carlos hung up, I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. Sadness for Tyler's lost opportunity and for the ongoing tension with Jessica. Vindication that I'd held firm to boundaries that protected my autonomy and dignity while refusing to enable irresponsible behavior. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Pastor Roberts called that afternoon with news that would change everything. "Maggie, I've been thinking about Tyler's situation, and I have a proposal. Our music program has some scholarship funds available, and after hearing him play during their visit, I think he'd be a perfect candidate." "Scholarship funds?" "A bequest from a church member who passed last year. She wanted the money used to support young musicians who showed exceptional promise. Tyler certainly qualifies." The irony was beautiful. Tyler would get his musical education opportunity, but not through his family's manipulation or my compromise of principles. He'd earn it through his own talent and the community support that came from his genuine connection to Pine Lake's music program. Pastor Roberts, that would be wonderful. But I should mention that his grandmother might not be available to provide any additional support. "No need. This covers everything, including travel and housing. All Tyler needs to do is commit to sharing what he learns with our church music program when he returns." When I called Carlos with the news, his relief was palpable. "I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Thompson, or Pastor Roberts." "Thank me by making sure Tyler understands that this opportunity came through his own merit and the generosity of people who believe in his talent, not through family financial rescue." "I'll make sure he understands." The conversation with Jessica, when it finally came, was predictably complicated. She called 3 days later, her voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested she was working hard to manage her emotions. "Carlos told me about the scholarship. I wanted to thank you for arranging it." "I didn't arrange anything. Pastor Roberts identified a funding source that Tyler qualified for based on his talent." "But you must have mentioned his situation." "I mentioned that he wouldn't be attending the program because of a family financial decision. Pastor Roberts came up with the scholarship idea on his own." Jessica was quiet for a moment, and I could sense her struggling with the implications of what had happened. Tyler's opportunity had been restored, but not through the family dynamic she'd been trying to recreate. Instead, it had come through community support, based on merit rather than guilt or obligation. "I owe you another apology," she said finally, "for using Tyler's education money without discussing it with you first. Carlos explained why that was wrong, and I understand now that it violated the trust behind your gift. Thank you for acknowledging that. And I owe you an apology for trying to manipulate you into fixing our mistake. I fell back into old patterns of seeing you as the solution to our problems, rather than as a person with your own boundaries and priorities." The admission was more complete than any Jessica had made before, and it gave me hope that she was genuinely learning from these experiences, rather than just apologizing to smooth things over. "I appreciate that, Jessica. Change is difficult. For all of us." "Mom, can I ask you something? When you refused to help with Tyler's program, was part of you happy that we were suffering consequences for treating you badly?" The question was uncomfortably perceptive, and it deserved an honest answer. Part of me was satisfied that actions had consequences, yes. But I wasn't happy about Tyler's disappointment or your financial stress. I was just determined not to enable the pattern that had damaged our relationship for so long. Even if it meant Tyler missing his opportunity? Even then. Because the alternative was teaching all of you that manipulation works, that guilt can override boundaries, that I'm still available to rescue you from the results of your own choices. Jessica sighed. "It's strange. Part of me is angry that you wouldn't help, but another part of me is proud of you for standing firm. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. The part of you that's angry is the part that still wants me to be the mother who solves all your problems. The part that's proud recognizes that I'm healthier and stronger when I maintain my boundaries. I'm trying to be the second part more often." "I can see that, and I appreciate the effort." Summer arrived in Pine Lake with a burst of activity that kept me busier than I'd been since arriving. The tourist season brought new challenges too. The food assistance program as temporary workers struggled to find affordable housing and adequate wages. The church's community meal program expanded to serve lunch as well as breakfast, and I found myself coordinating volunteer schedules and food donations with the efficiency I'd developed over decades of cafeteria management. Tyler's scholarship had indeed come through, and he'd left for his summer program with genuine excitement about the opportunity. More importantly, he understood that his place had been earned through talent and merit rather than family manipulation or financial rescue. Carlos had done an excellent job explaining the situation in terms that preserved Tyler's pride while teaching important lessons about responsibility and consequences. Sophie had gotten a summer job at a local veterinary clinic and was saving money for college with the single-minded determination that reminded me of myself at her age. Jessica's real estate business had picked up with the summer market, and Carlos had found several smaller contracts that would carry them through until larger opportunities developed. In other words, the family crisis that had seemed so desperate in May had resolved itself through hard work and adaptation rather than through my financial intervention. They'd learned that they could weather difficulties without relying on my resources, and I'd learned that refusing to rescue them didn't mean I didn't love them. The real test of our evolved relationship came in July when Jessica called with news that made my heart stop. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that we're going to be traveling to Pine Lake next week. Carlos has a potential job there, something about renovating the old warehouse district, and we thought we'd combine it with a family visit." The casual way she mentioned the business opportunity sent warning bells ringing in my head. "Carlos is considering work in Pine Lake?" "Well, the Pine Lake City Council apparently heard about his reputation through someone who knew about his connection to you. They reached out about a major renovation project that could last through the winter." Something in Jessica's tone suggested there was more to this story than she was revealing. "Jessica, did you have anything to do with Carlos being contacted for this job?" A pause. I might have mentioned to Pastor Roberts during our visit that Carlos was looking for work, and Pastor Roberts might have mentioned it to someone on the city council. So you used your connection to me and my standing in the community to get Carlos work. I used available resources to help my family. Yes. Is that wrong? The question hung between us, loaded with all the complexity of our evolving relationship. On one hand, Jessica was being resourceful in helping her husband find work during a difficult period. On the other hand, she was trading on my reputation and relationships without asking my permission or considering how it might affect my position. In the community, Jessica, using my relationships to benefit your family without discussing it with me first puts me in a very awkward position. What if Carlos gets this job and then performs poorly? What if there are problems with the work or conflicts with the city council? My reputation becomes tied to his performance. Carlos is excellent at his job. There won't be problems. That's not the point. The point is that you made decisions that affect my standing in my community without consulting me. Just like you made decisions about Tyler's education money without consulting me. Another pause, longer this time. I didn't think about it that way. I know you didn't, but that's exactly the problem. You still default to seeing me as an extension of your family, rather than as an independent person with my own relationships and reputation to protect. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Jessica had indeed overstepped, using my name and connections in ways that could have compromised my carefully built standing in Pine Lake. The fact that her intentions were good didn't change the fundamental violation of boundaries and trust. In the end, we agreed that Carlos would withdraw from consideration for the Pine Lake job and pursue opportunities that came through his own networking and reputation. It wasn't easy for Jessica to make that call, and I could hear the frustration in her voice as she explained to Carlos why he needed to decline what might have been a lucrative contract. But the incident also provided an opportunity for growth. Jessica began to understand how her actions affected not just her immediate family, but also my position and relationships in my chosen community. More importantly, she began to recognize that my independence wasn't just about living in my own space, but about maintaining my own reputation and relationships without interference from family obligations. The summer visit, when it finally happened, was relaxed and genuine in ways that their spring visit hadn't quite achieved. Jessica and the kids stayed at the inn again, but this time there was no underlying agenda, no business opportunities being pursued, no sense that they were evaluating my choices or trying to convince me to return to Riverside. Instead, we simply enjoyed each other's company. Sophie helped with the community meal program and struck up friendships with several local teenagers who were working summer jobs. Tyler, fresh from his music program, performed at the church's summer concert and charmed everyone with his enthusiasm and skill. Jessica spent time getting to know my friends as people rather than as evidence of my new life's success or failure. Most importantly, Jessica seemed to finally understand that my life in Pine Lake wasn't a rejection of her or a punishment for past conflicts. It was simply the life I'd chosen for myself, built around work that mattered to me and relationships that brought me joy. The moment that crystallized this understanding came on their last evening, when we were all sitting on the inn's porch watching the sunset over the lake. Sophie was reading a book, Tyler was composing something on his phone, and Jessica and I were sharing comfortable silence. "I used to think this place was about you getting away from us," Jessica said quietly. "But it's not, is it? It's about you finding yourself." "Both things can be true," I replied. I needed distance from the old dynamic to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by my role in your lives. But what I found here isn't about rejection. It's about becoming. Becoming what? Becoming the person I was meant to be before I got lost in other people's expectations. Jessica nodded, and I could see her processing this distinction. "I think I understand now why you can't come back to Riverside. Not because you don't love us, but because that place holds too many old patterns." "Exactly. I love you all deeply. but I love myself too. And this is where I can be both a mother and grandmother and a whole person in my own right. That evening, as they prepared to leave the next morning, Tyler approached me with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a composition he'd written during his summer program, inspired by his time in Pine Lake and dedicated to my grandmother, who taught me that it's never too late to find where you belong. The piece was beautiful, complex enough to showcase his growing skills, but accessible enough for the church music program to perform. More importantly, it captured something essential about Pine Lake's peaceful beauty and the sense of belonging I'd found here. "I want to premiere it at the church's Christmas concert," Tyler said, "if that's okay with you." "More than okay. I'd be honored." Sophie's goodbye was tearful, but not desperate. She'd made plans to apply to colleges within driving distance of Pine Lake, drawn by the town's proximity to the lake, and the possibility of continuing to volunteer with the community programs I coordinated. "I love what you've built here, Grandma," she said. "It feels real in a way that a lot of places don't." "Real is exactly what I was hoping for," I replied. Jessica's farewell was the most complex, weighted with all the history between us and all the growth we'd both experienced over the past year. We hugged tightly, but without the desperation that had characterized our goodbyes during the worst periods of our relationship. "Thank you for showing me how to love without losing yourself," she said. "I'm still learning, but I think I'm getting better at it." "We're both learning. That's all any of us can do." As their car disappeared around the familiar corner, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from authentic connection freely chosen and maintained through mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. Jessica and I would never have the uncomplicated relationship I'd once imagined possible, but we'd found something better, an honest partnership between two adults who'd learned to see each other clearly. The year's cycle completed itself in autumn, with Pine Lake settling into the quiet preparations for another winter. The tourist season had been good for everyone, bringing revenue to local businesses and opportunities for the community programs I helped coordinate. My role in the town's fabric had deepened, with the city council asking me to serve on the planning committee for next year's centennial celebration. On the anniversary of my arrival at the Greyhound station, I took a walk to the spot where my new life had begun. The bench was the same. The tin awning still provided modest shelter, but the woman standing there bore little resemblance to the frightened, abandoned figure who'd clutched a $20 bill and wondered how she'd survive. I'd not only survived, I'd thrived beyond anything I could have imagined when Jessica drove away that October night. I'd built a community of chosen family, found work that utilized decades of accumulated skills, and discovered an identity that wasn't dependent on other people's needs or expectations. More importantly, I'd learned the difference between love and enabling, between helping and rescuing, between being needed and being valued. The family relationships I'd salvaged were stronger now precisely because they were based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than assumed roles. Jessica called that evening, as if she'd sensed the significance of the date. "I was thinking about you today," she said, "about how much has changed since this time last year." "Everything has changed," I agreed. "Some things for the better, some things just differently." "Do you ever regret it? Any of it?" I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the pain of that initial abandonment? The terror of starting over with nothing? The months of uncertainty about whether our family bonds could survive such fundamental change? "I regret that it took such an extreme crisis to force necessary changes," I said finally. "But I don't regret where we ended up. I think we're all healthier now, more honest with ourselves and each other. Even if it means we see each other less, quality over quantity. The time we spend together now is genuine, based on choice rather than guilt or habit. I love you, Mom. Not the version of you that existed to serve our needs, but the real you. The woman who was brave enough to build a new life at 67 and strong enough to maintain boundaries even when it hurt. I love you too, Jessica. All of you. And I'm proud of the growth you've shown, the way you've learned to love without trying to control. After we hung up, I sat on my small balcony watching stars appear over Pine Lake's quiet surface. Tomorrow would bring another day of chosen work, freely given friendship, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. The daughter who'd tried to teach me about dependence had instead taught me about independence. The crisis that was meant to break me had instead revealed strength I didn't know I possessed. The abandonment that was supposed to demonstrate my helplessness had instead proven my capability. Sometimes the cruelest gifts become the most precious blessings. Sometimes losing everything allows you to discover what truly matters. Sometimes disappearing from one life makes it possible to appear in another, more authentic version of yourself. As I prepared for bed in my small room above Main Street, I thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that night at the bus station. Tyler would always remember that talent and effort mattered more than family rescue. Sophie had learned that love could exist without sacrifice of self. Carlos had seen that enabling and helping were different things entirely. And Jessica had discovered that releasing control didn't mean losing connection, that respecting someone's autonomy could actually strengthen rather than weaken family bonds. The woman who'd been dropped at a bus station with $20 and told to survive on her own had done more than survive. She'd learned to thrive in ways that transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. It was, I realized as sleep overtook me, the most valuable lesson I'd ever taught or learned. Sometimes the greatest act of love is setting someone free to discover who they're capable of becoming, even when that someone is yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.